Welcome back, everybody, to Neutrality Studies. Today, with an update by my friend and colleague, Ian Proud. Ian, welcome back.
Hey, Pascal, very nice to see you again.
Nice seeing you too. This time not in person as we did in Tbilisi, but still good seeing you. Tell me, Ian, you are a former British diplomat. You've seen a lot of diplomacy over the years, and right now we have a complete absence of diplomacy again. We've got these two wars that are going on, and in the last days we saw how certain forces seem to be working on merging the two, as the Ukrainians apparently attacked an Iranian ship in the not even in the Black Sea, but in the Caspian Sea, next doors. What did you make out of that?
Well, clearly, Zelensky, one of his objectives for Zelensky, it seems to me, is to going to keep the Americans in the fight and to keep Trump in the fight. In Ukraine, this kind of war that really should end because it's absolutely devastating Ukraine and, really kind of devastating the people of Ukraine as well in the process, and is also actually incidentally facing increasing resistance domestically because most Ukrainians want the war to end, but Zelensky doesn't want the war to end for his own reasons, and part of his strategy is to kind of keep Trump interested. And of course, the best way to do that is to kind of turn against Iran as well, to open a second front. And therefore, by striking an Iranian sort of cargo ship in the Caspian Sea, he's kind of nodding to Trump that he's on Trump's side, it seems to me. But of course, there are risks to that too, because the Iranian ballistic missile technology, which has been shown to sort of good effect really since the start of the war in February, there are risks that actually Ukraine now is going to be subject not only to increased ballistic missile attacks from Russia itself, but now from Iran too. And in circumstances where Ukraine has kind of lost the ability to kind of really intercept missiles because it's running out of anti-aircraft kind of missile batteries and munitions, then it's going to make its cities and its people increasingly vulnerable. So this seems to be yet another desperate attempt by Zelensky, but actually not really thinking about the interests of his people, who will suffer if Iran starts to get involved and striking Ukraine directly.
We know that Mr. Zelensky is about to go to the United States to the funeral of what's his name, Lindsey Graham, the famous warmonger and neocon who recently passed away, and of course he will there have probably a meeting with Donald Trump as well. And do you think this is now going to be another round of war diplomacy in order to raise some funds and to convince the United States to keep payrolling the Ukraine war?
Of course it is. Zelensky hardly seems to spend any time in his own country while his country people are being subject to kind of daily missile bombardments. I mean, that is just the sad and devastating nature of war. If the war ended, of course, these things would stop. But actually, Zelensky is determined to get more money, get more weapons, get more political level support, in particular from the Americans. And therefore, clearly his aim in going to the US is not really to kind of pay respects to Lindsey Graham, somebody that I certainly myself won't miss, but is to drum up more support for the war. And that is absolutely obvious. I mean, he's always traveling. He was in the UK, yesterday they're at a naval base. The UK was talking about additional kind of drone jamming capabilities. It's all about providing more tech, more money, more political support. And that's really the only thing that Zelensky kind of cares about. And the bizarre thing is, I think British mainstream media newspapers are becoming increasingly comedic. The Telegraph, which is perhaps the worst here in the United Kingdom, had this headline yesterday that, Trump is meeting two people in DC, Zelensky, who's desperate for peace, and then Netanyahu, who's desperate for war. And it's just, oh my goodness, it was just yet another kind of clownish mainstream media report that actually Zelensky is somehow the peacemaker. He clearly isn't.
I keep wondering, the mainstream media, I've now looked at them for the last 4 years or so that have been doing this, 4.5, and they just seem to be getting worse and worse with the propaganda that they have to resort to just in order to somehow cling to a certain image. Right now, it seems that they did the mainstream media in the West, let's say in the UK, did we already past the point where they try to pretend that actually Ukraine is winning, because it seems that it's sinking in that on the battlefield, it's not at all winning. The only thing they're managing to do is to blow up wildberry warehouses, civilian infrastructure. Well done, Ukraine. You chose a huge target, a massive warehouse, and you managed to hit it and kill civilians in there. That seems to be the one thing that they've got going. But on the other hand, the mainstream media now seems to be catching on to the fact that actually on the battlefield, the Russians are advancing very systematically, and Odessa is now directly in the crosshairs. What's the situation in the UK in the mass media?
Well, the mass media completely censors kind of real analysis, I'd say, not even real debate, but kind of real sort of analysis, real evidence. And it kind of lacks that strategic perspective on the war. So, okay, Wildberries attacks, things go bang, big explosions. They make good photographs for newspapers. These are held up as signs of success. Clearly, the strikes on all the primaries, not just the fact they're happening, but the fact they're happening deeper and deeper inside of Russia. There was one in Tumen recently, which is a very, very long way from Ukraine. And, the Ukraine can do this is held up as a sign that it got even better capabilities to really kind of bring Russia to its knees. But, and of course, that is causing petrol shortages, in Russia. We know that. I mean, Russian contacts say, that is true. But when you step back from the canvas, actually, nobody's really thinking about what the strategy of the war is. And this has always been an attritional war. Wars are won by economies, not by armies. As we know, Russia has the industrial base, it has the economic size, it has the population size, and it has the kind of capacity, the industrial capacity, to keep fighting much longer than Ukraine has. And as you say, small, very incremental advances are being made on the battlefield, but that's not really the kind of strategy, it seems to me. From the Russian side, they're really looking to bleed the Europeans and the Ukrainians white. But the mainstream media really never focuses on this bigger strategic picture. They like pictures of things exploding as signs of success, and that's what they cling to. And I don't really know what the tipping point is when they realize actually things are sort of going badly wrong, because Ukraine is already depopulated. It's got about 2/3 of its kind of pre-war population left in the country. There's one pensioner for every one worker. It's totally reliant on economic aid, from the West. It has massive AWOL problems with people deserting, increasing domestic unrest where busification is going badly and people are turning against, recruitment officers in the streets. They're changing their defense minister and their head of the army while they're saying they're winning militarily. That they can't even pass budgetary laws through the parliament because, Zelensky faces an increasing struggle within parliament. Corruption is happening all the time, and these sorts of things. But the West simply never focuses. Not just they don't focus on these, but they don't even talk about it, because the only thing they want to talk about is the things that go bang, the nice pictures of explosions. And so that's where we are. And I don't really know what's going to break that almost trance, that kind of trance that journalists are in.
Hey, just a very quick note. The best way to support this channel is by signing up for my free Substack. You can also help with a paid subscription there, or you can get some of our new merch on neutralitystudies.com. Links below. See you there.
I mean, we're seeing right now in the UK how even a change on government doesn't really impact anything. I mean, your new prime minister, can you tell us a little bit about it and what has been like this first week or his first 10 days in office like now?
Well, you have to bear in mind that his big priorities are the domestic agenda. There's a real feeling in the United Kingdom that public services have been neglected, ordinary people's needs have been forgotten about, even by his predecessor, Keir Starmer, who came in on the pledge to kind of fix these problems. We have 100% of debt to GDP in the United Kingdom, the highest debt servicing costs in the developing world. And yet we need to spend more money. Lots of people want us to spend more money on defense and that sort of thing. So his biggest priority is to kind of fix that. But of course, what he's therefore doing is not even trying to kind of say, well, actually, should we maybe think about our foreign policy too, and maybe connect the linkages between our domestic challenges in terms of our economic problems, high energy costs, cost of living crisis, social discontent, and the fact that these wars are happening. There's just no possibility to connect the two. So what you actually see is statements that actually, well, we're just going to have exactly the same foreign policy as the previous person had, which is to support Ukraine come what may, and actually to say, well, the situation in the Middle East is bad, but we want to see it end. And it's really, really sad about Gaza, but we have to make sure that we support Israel. So absolutely kind of no change at all. And one of the reasons for this is they don't have the bandwidth to kind of come up with new ideas because the domestic is their biggest priority. But B, because he's the 7th prime minister in the space of 10 years. And our leaders are coming and going so quickly that actually they no longer really have the agency and the power to set policy. The policy is set by the people who are there all the time, what some people call the deep state, the men and women in grey suits in the background. They own the policy. And when a new guy comes along, they say, well, this is a policy, say this. And that's what our elected officials do. So that is the nature of our democracy, sadly, today.
So people faces come and go, but the agenda remains, and the agenda still today seems to be very firmly anti-Russian and pro-war. I mean, no, not pro-war with Iran. I mean, in Europe, the Iran war is not popular, right? But there's no opposition to it. I mean, in my perception right now, European leaders, including the UK, they just basically are silent on this, right? As in United States, you do what you have to. We're not gonna oppose anything, but we're not directly gonna join. Or what's your perception of how they are approaching this one versus the very, very noisy kind of drum beating of war against Russia?
Well, there are some people in Europe who do speak out. For example, the Spanish Prime Minister has spoken out about the completely crazy, nonsensical kind of policy of Donald Trump. But of course, the Europeans feel less able. The mainstream Western Europeans, the main powers, Britain, France, and Germany, essentially feel less able to do that. Because they don't want to annoy Trump even further, and make him go further away from their goal, which is to defeat Russia, in Ukraine. So therefore, they have to go soft on Iran to keep Trump in the fight in Ukraine, firstly. And also because they're massively beholden to vested interests that actually want the war to continue. The media interests that are avowedly Russophobic, the defense industrial interests that see huge profits from the war continuing, and that sort of thing. And the whole Overton window, which has become so small that actually elected officials are now prisoners of a policy that they no longer create. So that's why you get this odd disconnect between, I think, the two, because, if we weren't so invested in Ukraine, it would be easier to kind of speak out about Iran. But actually, we can't do that because you need Trump's help in Ukraine. And everybody knows, I mean, I was talking to Dr. Jennifer Kavanagh the other day that actually, the Ukrainians won't be able to strike 2,000 kilometers inside of Russia without US intelligence. So for as much as Trump says that actually, he wants to, end the war in Ukraine, the Americans are still knees deep in that war. Everybody knows it. And the Brits, the French, the Germans want to keep it that way.
This is part of the thing that is so frustrating also for, I believe, for us here that are trying to do some analysis, because the theatrics of it is actually part and parcel of this entire war game, right? The way that the war is fought, as much in the minds and hearts of people as it is fought on the TV screens, in order for the United States to be able to pretend to be a neutral outsider and just throwing out proposals in order to end this horrible war, when in fact they're the driving force, of course, behind this slaughter continuing on the NATO side. Do you see any kind of resistance to this in the general population? I mean, it seems to me that the frustration, actually the European frustration in the population about these wars are actually growing, and especially the opposition to Donald Trump inside Europe seems to be growing. What is your sense for public perception?
Well, I think there is an increasing, resistance to the kind of the essentially kind of rotten policy-making core at the heart of our elected governments, not just in the United Kingdom, but in France and Germany as well. We see that with kind of shifting alliances, shifting voting preferences towards kind of newer parties like AFD, like National Rally, like Reform, in the United Kingdom. But the reality is that actually there's a British Foreign Policy Group survey that said that actually most people still get their news, most British people, I assume the same for the French and the Germans, from televisual kind of news broadcasters more than anything else by far, about 2/3 in total. So, the work that you do, Danny Davis, Glenn Dees and Alexander Mercurius, others, is really important, but you still form a tiny proportion of the mix in terms of how people get access to their news. That is shifting, but that shift is going to take, several years to kind of work its way through. So, and the mainstream media is overwhelmingly sort of pro-war. So it's very, very difficult to kind of shift that, public perception when all you see is photographs and pictures of wild berries and people saying, "Oh, isn't that great?" and Royal Marines landing on a Russian oil tanker, which absolutely makes no difference at all, really, to the big picture of Russia's export kind of model and that sort of thing. What I think is happening right now is that actually, despite the mainstream media having a complete stranglehold on how the war is described, people nevertheless feel discontented with their governments. They haven't yet made the intellectual connection between how war is actually making their day-to-day lives worse, how sending £4 to £5 million a year to a war that can't be won in Ukraine is contributing to a reduction in the quality of their public services and also in the increase in their cost of living because energy prices are so high. But they feel that discontent, and actually that, I think that sort of eventually that connection will be made. I don't think it's been made, yet. But the discontent won't go away, and people are looking for the alternatives, and the alternatives available are those people who say, well, actually, why can't we just have a normal relationship with Russia, for example, in the case of AFD?
Yeah, and I mean, since you've worked in Russia for many years, what is your take how they are now dealing with this situation? Because the Ukrainians have been shifting, I mean, the US NATO Ukrainian alliance has been shifting their strategy away from trying to impact the direct battlefield, which is something that the Russians are doing systematically, into these long range strikes. And they've chosen different types of targets, right? First, it was the petroleum manufacturing plants all over Russia, but then Russia got better at defending those. Then they've tried to hit these industrial sites, and the Russians seem to be willing to kind of absorb the strikes, and they are not escalating on their side. I mean, they're escalating towards Odessa, but it seems to me that what the Ukrainians and NATO is really looking for is to provoke Russia into a larger strike against Europe, especially Ukraine, right? Ukraine would love this war to finally break out in the entire NATO area, because that's kind of the only thing that can still save them at this point, if anything at all. But Russia's not taking the bait. I mean, what's your take on Russia's reactions and how it is actually still sticking to what others, Alexander Mercurius and so on, call maximum restraint policies?
I actually agree with that characterization that they're using maximum restraint. And of course, people can't, people watching the mainstream TV news in the UK can't see that, because all they see is, like a shopping mall was struck with a ballistic missile yesterday, for example, as a direct reprisal for the wild berries, for example. So, they see Russian missiles, landing, and they say, well, Russia is this evil terrorist country. They don't make the connection to the Ukrainian missiles landing in Russian oil refineries and wild berries depots. It's enough that the Russians are doing these bad things, and therefore Ukraine has to do the same in return, for example. So, but I mean, I think what I can absolutely say about the Russians is that reciprocity is absolutely hardwired in terms of their doctrine. I remember actually sitting in St. Petersburg at the International Economic Forum, 1 year, maybe 2016 perhaps, and Putin sat on the stage and he quoted Newton's, law that an action produces an equal or an opposite reaction, and he actually said that, on the stage. And you see that in everything that Russia does. Ukraine strikes wild berries. they strike a shopping mall. Ukraine strikes an oil refinery. Russia strikes, a port facility, closing off Ukraine's ability to export grain to the world, basically making Ukraine a landlocked state, essentially, which is what the strikes on Odessa are doing. So everything that Russia does now is fully locked in the reciprocity, mode, where you do something and we'll do something in return, and possibly even harder than you've done to us. And I often say about the Russians to people who've never been to Russia, never really met a Russian person, is that if you offer a Russian handshake and friendship, they'll be your friend for life. If you invite them out for a fight, they'll take you up on the offer and try and hit you harder than you hit them. And that is just my understanding, having lived and engaged and made friends with Russians of their doctrine. So what the question is, why Russia doesn't go further. That is the salient question. But I mean, I think the answer to that is they don't need to. They don't need to, because they have the resources to keep doing this for as long as Ukraine wants to do this. And Europe is going to run out of resources to support Ukraine more than Russia runs out of resources. But Putin's challenge is actually, how does he manage the different factions within Russia, where there are some hardliners like the Karaganovs and so on that say, well, we should just nuke someplace in Ukraine, or we should strike some depot inside of a NATO territory and escalate that way. Steve Jeremy's really good in terms of how that scenario, that war scenario of a conventional strike on NATO might play out. And it probably wouldn't play out very well for Europe itself. But nevertheless, Putin doesn't want to do that because A, he doesn't need to do it, and B, he does ultimately, I think, hold out hopes of some sort of equalization, normalization of the relationship with Europe over the long term, and he's aware of the kind of the much more kind of catastrophic risks to Russia from escalating with NATO, even if NATO may, suffer, badly, in the circumstances. So he's always playing a balancing act. But right now, he doesn't need to escalate. He can just do the tit for tat, the reciprocity approach, for as long as he needs to, while managing those constituencies that want him to go in harder. And it's also helpful for him in some ways to do that, because, when you get Karaganov saying, well, let's nuke someplace, then actually kind of that spreads fear and panic in Europe. And Putin, he never really engages with this discussion. You get the Medvedevs talking about the nuclear torpedoes. Putin never says anything, but that's part of the game too. There's a certain element of kind of scaring the Europeans in this as well.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of Karaganov is that the scare of nuclear war needs to come back to the Europeans, right? So if they actually perceive that this is a discussion in Russia, that would actually be, in his sense, even without throwing a nuke, right? But the point to me is that the Europeans at the moment don't seem scared. They don't seem scared of war with the Russians, which worries me a lot. On the other hand, I think I absolutely agree with your analysis. The Russians know that their approach is working. The battlefield is developing the way that they want to. These strikes that they are enduring is still on a level. I looked it up the other day. We must just keep in mind. I hope I got the right number now, but so I need to look it up again. Around 12,000 people die every year in Russia of car accidents. Something around there. I'll look it up again just to make sure that I got it. But so we're still on a level, where, 12,000 people in car accidents, you don't even notice, right? Because that's just statistics. So, but of course, these kind of strikes and so on, in this sense, from Ukraine are not matchmaking, but they're quite influential with the public politically, right, within Russia, and that's certainly a danger. On the other hand, just like with Iran, I think Russia and Iran both believe that they figured out how to answer these attacks that are coming, and they're willing to implement that over the long run. How long do you think is Europe still able to actually keep going? Because if it is now a game of who has the longer breath, it seems to me that Europe might actually be at the shorter end of the stick.
Well, I've said that for a long time that is the case. That Europe, doesn't have either the democratic or the economic means to kind of sustain this fight longer than Russia does, and that's an analysis that I maintain even today. And I think the tipping point, won't be events on the battlefield, but there'll be actual elections in individual countries themselves, which lead to some sort of change in the kind of balance of power in those countries, starting with France next year with the presidential election, where, you know, Le Pen, you know, has a very, very good chance of winning that, which, you know, could have seismic implications, not just for, you know, domestic politics in France, you know, France's relationship with the EU, but actually Europe's relationship with the war in Ukraine as well. You know, because a Le Pen government is not going to want Ukraine to join the European Union, you know, on equal terms. For the first time, the kind of you know, the truth that people refuse to speak, that actually Ukraine is too hot a potato to allow to join the EU, would actually be much more brought to the surface by the French, who say, well, we're not going to give our you know, French farmers subsidies to Ukrainian farmers. It's something that everybody knows about. The polls are exactly the same, but nobody ever talks about that. So that's that. And say, well, actually, and by the way, why are we sending all this money to Ukraine to fight a war that they're losing and their country is falling apart and becoming a failed state on the periphery of Europe? That conversation would come front and center as well. And, you know, fast forward to 2029, you've got the German elections, you've got the UK elections where, you know, AfD, if not the outright winners, they could be in some sort of greater position of power within the German federal system. Reform could be in power. I mean, these things are going to be the kind of democratic events which change radically the conversation, you know, the policy conversation, which has been completely absent for the past 12 years about actually, are we really doing the right thing in Ukraine? So I think it's that, you know, these democratic shifts that are going to be the things that change. And that brings us back to kind of ordinary people feeling actually left behind by the mainstream status quo, which actually seems to prioritize wars in other countries over domestic problems and things that ordinary people really care about. Because we all know that ordinary folk, they don't really know anything about Russia or Ukraine. Ordinary people think about their day-to-day needs, their kids' health and happiness, whether they got food on the table. This is what people care about. And ultimately, that's the thing that will decide the outcome of the war in Ukraine. Foreign policy always starts and ends at home.
Yeah, but that's the point where these politicians or these systems actually then whip up populations into the willingness to go to war, right? And it's absolutely horrible. And we saw that happening. We saw how it went down in Ukraine, where Mr. Zelensky was elected on a peace mandate, right? He was elected as the peace candidate, the man who was supposed to make relations with Russia better again. And in the end, everything went completely south with these constant incremental salami slicing tactic of escalation bit by bit. And in the end, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine, that went over the border. Yes. So you see how you can create this kind of, you know, reciprocal relationship that in the end then gives the warmongers actually what they want, the big fighting. But my question was rather also meant about the economic situation, because the the sanctions that the Europeans put on Russia put already quite a bit of strain on the European economies that are deindustrializing and that are lost access to cheap energy sources. And now with the Iran war, we've got another energy crisis that is also hitting the Europeans hard again. I mean, how long do you think it is before the gasoline prices and especially diesel prices, jet fuel prices in Europe are actually going to rise? Because we are nearing now the end of the strategic reserves that several countries have been dipping into, especially the United States. Do you have any feeling for where we are economically?
Well, economically, I mean, as you say, the Iran war is putting further downward pressure, or for that matter, upward pressure on prices, you know, in Europe, which have precipitated this kind of deindustrialization. So I think people can see that, but I think what people aren't doing, certainly in terms of the mainstream narrative, is connecting that, you know, that linkage between Iran and actually the war in Ukraine, which is the thing that really started the energy crisis and then did deindustrialization, you know, in Europe itself. So they're trying to kind of put all the blame on the Iran war and say, well, if we end the Iran war, then actually the energy crisis will end. But clearly that isn't actually true, because, you know, without access to cheap Russian energy, buying, you know, expensive American LNG, you know, the economic picture will still be worse. I mean, the UK has the highest energy costs in the G7. You know, for example, we're an island nation and so on. But people aren't making that sort of intellectual connection with the fact that actually this is also related to the war in Ukraine. So economically across Europe, the situation, you know, is bad. Nobody's joining the dots except the citizens who are actually feeling it in their pockets. And I think, again, it comes back to the democratic point that actually, our governments aren't actually making good economic policies that ensure that our cost of living is manageable, that our economies are sort of producing jobs, and opportunities for people and providing public services. It always comes back to that. And actually, the situation in Europe is quite bad, and ordinary people are feeling it increasingly and feeling that their governments aren't actually providing the policy responses that they need to resolve the situation. I think that is the bedrock of the discontent and disenfranchisement we see across Europe right now, which ultimately will settle the war in Ukraine, whether or not individual citizens even think about the war in Ukraine as a causal factor.
What do you think? What do you think is this doing to the European Union? I mean, you're sitting in a country that actually said, as the only one yet, that no, we're leaving. Bye, guys. Exactly 10 years ago, actually. To me, retrospectively, seems like not the worst decision to take. At the moment, I thought it was horribly bad. But the UK actually figured out a way to still rekindle its relationship with the EU. Seems that there are forces in the UK now that would rather like to rejoin again, but I don't think that has any kind of majority. Then again, these people don't necessarily go for majorities; they go for what they can do. Because I wonder about this right now. What I mean, Europe is so deep in a hole that they dug themselves, that I just wonder how to get out of that. I mean, because we are also actually seeing this increasingly draconian approach of the Europeans toward their own people, right? With Jacques Bull, with Nathalie Yamp, with the sanctions, with the UK, how the UK treats its own dissidents against the Gaza genocide, with Palestine Action, like even arresting grandmothers and whatnot, arresting Jews, by the way, who opposed the genocide. And are we headed in Europe actually toward this moment where once the Ukraine war once it becomes clear that this is not going to be a Western victory, that these systems are then going to start looking for more enemies from within? Or am I just being very pessimistic here?
I think the European Union project itself is under significant pressure, actually, and I think the reason for that is because its purpose and its raison d'etre have changed, and it's changed because of the bureaucratic forces within the institutions of Europe that actually demand increasing power, and authority for themselves at the expense of sovereign nations, within the project itself. So it's a crisis of actually the institutions of Europe rather than Europe itself. Because what is Europe? Europe is the European Union is 27 countries, but there are many more countries than that are part of Europe, right? Including actually, Russia, of course, which, in geographical terms is also kind of part of Europe. Europe is the people, the civilizations, the societies, and so on. And the big success of Europe for many years, the European Union project was in actually reducing barriers between peoples and actually, having sovereign nations where borders were nevertheless open and people were able to kind of engage with each other, economic, social, and cultural collaboration, something I talk about a lot. What has failed has been the incremental move towards the politicization, the militarization of the European project itself, which in the process of becoming ever more centralized is creating this sense that sovereignty amongst nation states is being eroded and citizens are reacting very badly to that. So, that's why what's happening in France, Germany, and the UK right now is happening, because actually lots of people like the idea of visiting Europe, but what they don't want, and certainly in the UK, ultimately the Brexit result happened because of a sense that actually unelected officials in Brussels were making decisions for British people, which were increasingly out of touch with what British people wanted. Well, that sense, of disempowerment amongst the Brits, ultimately led to people deciding that on balance they should leave. That doesn't mean citizens in Europe don't like Europe. It means that actually they have problems with the democratic deficit in the European institutions. What that brings us round to is that if you see some sort of shift in the politics of Europe, in nation states, I hope that leads to some sort of managed decline of the institutions themselves. And a sort of refocusing in on what's important about Europe in terms of the people of Europe, the community of Europe, including Russian people, and of course, including Ukrainian people and Moldovan people. But I think actually the bigger risk is that, the whole project falls apart, and that that creates even bigger risks in terms of conflict and so on, which nobody should want to hope for. But yes, managed decline is my hope. I'm less convinced that we'll get that sort of model.
Wow, if managed decline is the best case scenario, then we're really in for a rough ride. But do you have any, I know you're not very close to there, but maybe you followed it a bit, like what's happening in Hungary. I was quite taken aback that now it seems that the new elected government seems to be going after the old government, and the Fidesz party is being taken apart, and its politicians are being barred from running for office. Did you follow that story at all?
I do actually. Yeah, I should talk to Philip Pilkington. He's kind of quite good on these things. He can be a bit out there sometimes with some of his prognostications, but he's quite a good character to kind of talk to. I mean, look, essentially Peter Magyar is like Hungary's version of Zelensky. He's somebody who kind of fits. He's somebody who fits the required model for Europe. He says all the right things. He's kind of ultimately not going to block, Europe's kind of anti-Russian policy. He's not ultimately going to block endless military and financial support for Ukraine. It's a much more complicated relationship between Hungary and Ukraine, as we know. But nevertheless, he's going to do his best to kind of toe the European line, if that makes sense. So he fits, and Orban didn't, because Orban said uncomfortable things that actually this war's a disaster. Why should we make Hungarian people worse off and that sort of thing? But actually, as with Zelensky, as with Magyar, he is actually an increasingly repressive person within his own borders. In Ukraine, men are dragged off the streets, like dogs by the buttrification squads. In Hungary, a president can be asked to stand down because his political affiliation is the wrong affiliation. Colleges can be closed, public broadcasters can be shut down, freedom of speech can be shuttered, all of things, and actually worse than the European elites actually accused Viktor Orban of many years. The one differential is that actually Peter Magyar is saying the nice things to the Europeans that they like, and therefore they're happy to ignore that, in the same way that Zelensky is always smiles when he meets von der Leyen, and therefore the Europeans are happy to ignore the epic scale corruption in Ukraine, the buttrification, the disastrous kind of war prosecution and that sort of thing. So a bad leader is fine as long as they say the right things to Brussels, and I think that is essentially the best way to summarize kind of Peter Magyar. It's very cynical, but I'm afraid that is how I see it.
Yeah, but it's a good way of actually also summarizing where we are at in Europe. I mean, I would say the largest change we've seen in the last 10 years compared to previous decades is that, at least in my perspective, in previous decades, the whole human rights discourse, the rule of law discourse, the diplomacy discourse was more or less believable. It was kind of, there were always these gray areas. There was always these kind of things where you had academics who could go and drill down and write books about the hypocrisy of the whole system. But overall, it looked believable. And now we're just at the point where it's absolutely ludicrous, right? It's so far removed from reality that we actually understand, no, these are speech acts that have nothing to do with what's happening and everything with who does it. Our friends can do whatever they want. They could go out and murder children in the street, which they literally do in Gaza, right? And we are still calling them only democracy in the Middle East. Magyar could do the same in Hungary. We would still call him a good friend of democracy and whatnot. But if any one of the political opposition in somewhere does something even just slightly similar, they will be called out as the greatest dictators and threats to democracy. And by now, this is getting clearer. Do you also have that sense of that we are getting to more clarity, actually, at least in our quarters?
Well, I mean, we understand that very well. Whether ordinary people understand that, I'm less clear. I suspect they really, really don't. But I mean, of course, any analyst like us, we spend all our time looking at these things and thinking about these things and seeing the utter rank hypocrisy in it. But I think actually the vast majority of people just don't. I mean, how many ordinary people in the UK think about what Peter Magyar's doing in Hungary? I would suggest very, very few. So yeah, I mean, and of course we are marginalized because televisual media takes up 2/3 of how people get their news, and while we are a small and growing thing, we are still very small. So actually, I see, that what what changes the dial is kind of how people feel about their lives, and I think that is what's making people realize that we're just really badly led, as countries in Europe.
But 10 years ago, like, did you have the impression that, oh no, the West is such a hypocritical beast? I didn't. How about you? This is new to me, and I kind of new to me. I mean, I am very disillusioned with where we are in Europe. How about you? Were you already 10 years ago disillusioned, or was it still fine back then?
Well, 10 years ago I was in Moscow, so yes, I was already pretty disillusioned because I thought, well, why are we doing this? Why can't we just kind of, resolve this conflict, have normal relations, with Russia? Clearly, the Ukraine thing is difficult, but we have these kind of peace plans. We could kind of follow them through, Minsk II and that sort of thing, which, by the way, the British and the Americans kind of, hijacked. And the Russians actually wanted that. They wanted to know, this was the kind of really frustrating thing that, living in Moscow for 4.5 years was a remarkably normal experience. That they wanted close relations with Europe. If you went to St. Petersburg, you could get a train directly to Helsinki without any border controls. You see lots of European, visitors. I mean, they wanted to develop commercial links. They wanted to develop social and cultural links. Universities were collaborating with each other. The Bolshoi Theatre could perform in London, and they just wanted to get along, but we didn't, So yes, I'm afraid, unlike you, I was already disillusioned 10 years ago, and thinking about writing my book.
I didn't pay enough attention back then, obviously, but yeah, I still wonder how to, not only how to get out of this, but how to somehow manage this apparent drive of Europe to somehow find a significant other to antagonize. It's happening also in West Asia. The United States is constantly doing it around the world. The axis of evil, right? How to rein in this apparently Western obsession with finding an enemy.
Well, I mean, they found the enemy. They've got the eternal enemy in Russia, a place that's geographically much larger than Europe itself, which therefore can just, in any pictures, can be characterized as a threat just because of its size. You can throw in the snow, you can throw in the pictures of bears with their long claws. It just invites all these wonderful opportunities for people to say it's a threat to us. And the fact that, by the way, they have 6,000 nuclear weapons. So, and they're Slavs, so they're different from us, even though, FYI, Polish people, Ukrainians, let's not get into racial stereotypes, but whatever. I mean, we're all just people, but actually Russia invites, being, I don't know, just characterized as the other, and it's the only other that we need. Because, and if you look through history, whenever any kind of, political leader of a state is in trouble, what do? They find an enemy to kind of mobilize public support. Well, that's Russia. But I mean, Russia doesn't want to be seen that way. I mean, very clearly not. It feels clearly excluded, from the West. It feels as threatened, by the way, by China to its east, because, if you're in the west of Russia, it's, you've got all the biggest cities there. If you're in the east of Russia, you've got a population density of 1 to 2 people per square kilometer. So, people's characterization of Russia is all wrong. I mean, you meet Russian people, they're just like us. They're really nice people. If you're nice to them.
I was for the first time in Russia very recently, and one of the things that struck me is just how European Russia actually is, down to the languages that they speak. There's so many people who don't only speak English, but also French or German, or you find others who can. I mean, Czech is a language that some Russians can converse in. It's quite amazing. I mean, much more cultural diversity actually, and knowledge about the Europeans than.
And interesting. I'd go to different cities, outside of Moscow, and you'd find English pubs, Scottish pubs. I went to one cocktail bar once. There's an English, a black cab from London parked outside just to show the Englishness. People are still, Stas Koprivnik, the guy, I mean, he's pretty out there in terms of his pronouncements, but he's telling me the other day about this new brand of English beer they've got in Russia that, well, now, just like, the interest in stuff European, even during the Soviet Union, there's that fascination with European culture. Russian people don't want to feel isolated from the world. They're fascinated by the world, but actually they're also very proud people. And when they feel under threat, they'll fight back. That doesn't mean they don't want to have a normal relationship with us. I've always felt that they do.
Well, this is actually a glimmer of hope to me. For all the Russophobia and the hate for Russia that we find in Europe at the moment, and all of these horrible stereotypes, that we actually in Russia don't find that, and that we rather find this kind of constant question mark of how to get things going again, which was also the question that the organization asked that invited us to Russia, is like how to rebuild the bridges. That these questions are asked in Russia is something that gives me quite a bit of hope.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, the Russians always utterly confused. Why Europeans hate them so much. I mean, of course, the war's happening. You say, well, war's happening. Well, yeah, but why is the war happening? Look back in Russia's history. The Mongols, the Lithuanians, the Swedes, the French, the Nazis, and so on. They feel a sense of foreign threat. But actually, if you reach out the hand of friendship, they'll return it to you. I'm absolutely sure of that.
Yeah, and after 27 million dead Soviet citizens in the Second World War, it's quite a surprise that after all of that, there's still all of this goodwill toward the Europeans, because some of our Russian colleagues, especially Stas Krapivnik, also points out that it wasn't just the Germans who invaded. Those were massive contingents of European soldiers who invaded Russia, but the Soviet Union. But in any case, maybe just to wrap up our discussion now, what are the things that you are looking at the moment in terms of what's coming up on the political agenda? Because we are nearing August, and the hope is that things get a little bit more quiet, but I'm not sure about this, since there seems also to be preparations with the Iran war underway. What are the things that you are looking at the moment, or that you think will be significant in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, I think I'm obviously focused heavily on the UK agenda right now and what's shaping kind of UK foreign policy. But I mean, unfortunately, I see very little kind of change, particularly from the early pronouncements of the Burnham government. So that shifts attention, therefore, to the Iran war, and then the big question about how long can Trump keep kind of playing this game? The closer that the midterms, I mean, the big defining sort of political anchor point for this season is going to be the midterm elections in the US. And actually, the closer we get to those, the more the pressure will come on Trump to kind of find some resolution at a time when he'll face increasingly kind of vocal calls, from European partners to actually, bring this to an end because of the devastating economic consequences having for Europe itself, but for the global economy in particular. I mean, again, within the context of Trump, I mean, I want to talk to Michael Hudson again, on the sort of geoeconomics, because obviously Trump is now threatening another tariff round, 100% tariffs on countries that buy, Russian oil and gas, which is therefore, China, which is therefore India, which, Turkey, which takes us almost back a whole year in politics to when he tried this last year and failed. The big question is on the Donald Trump monopoly board. He keeps passing go and he keeps not collecting $200. So how he's going to kind of play that, and what this actually means for US politics, because I'm absolutely certain that actually whether it's a Democrat in charge or a Republican, I'm not really sure that's really going to change the kind of the foreign policy mindset in Washington, D.C. So the big question is, how can Europe save itself and actually have its own, and how can Britain save itself and have its own foreign policy identity, which allows itself to be more detached from the Americans and doesn't see kind of a greater separation between, the Europeans and the Americans as some sort of big strategic threat, which makes us even more vulnerable to the Russians. How can we have more kind of self-confidence in foreign policy terms? Say, well, actually, no, it's totally fine if we are more detached from the Americans. We can speak out more on the Gaza genocide. We can, and this sort of thing. But I just don't see that kind of split happening before next year when the elections start to hit. And I still think the war in Ukraine is going to go on for another year, unfortunately. So, just getting into the detail of all those kind of shifts that are happening and looking around the periphery in Hungary and so on, what's happening in China, match going against China in October, which I'm really looking forward to. So yeah, so much to kind of focus on. But I mean, the big defining moment will be the midterms.
The midterms, yeah. So we're all looking toward November already. It's only July, but this was a very good overview. Thank you very much for kind of giving us the picture also about how you're looking at Europe. People who want to find you, they should of course go to the Peacemonger on your YouTube channel and on Substack. That's just look at for the Peacemonger. Any other place where people should go?
Yeah, I'm on X, but I mean Substack and YouTube at Ian Proud, which is the Peacemonger, is exactly the places to find me. I'm just quite new, but I'm really enjoying it, getting into this space and having these conversations, which are desperately needed right now. So yeah, as always, thank you, Pascal. We know each other for a couple of years. You really helped to inspire me on this kind of pathway we're all taking together. Let's hope collectively our group of sort of a dissident realist can start to slowly shift the dial against huge tidal waves, frankly, of propaganda on the mainstream media.
I hope we can do exactly that. More discussions, more brains, more voices in order to not only analyze what's happening, but then also maybe give some outlook at how to make things better, which would be wonderful. And again, everybody, if you want to follow Ian, Google his name, find the Peacemonger on YouTube and on Substack. It's highly recommended. He's very, very active, especially on Substack in written form. It's a wonderful platform. Ian, congratulations on this, and see you again next time.
Thanks, Pascal. Always a pleasure. See you soon.